All right, so I'm going to do a real quick review of our units here. Um, just kind of hitting the larger points. This is not everything that's going to be on the test, but just going through a little bit of the bigger points. So, remember we talked about energy at the start of the unit. This whole unit deals with energy. Energy is the ability to do work. So if you have energy, you can do work. So there's two ways that organisms obtain energy. Some are heterotrophic. Heterotrophs are consumers, meaning they have to eat their own food to get energy or to create their own energy. And then autotrophs can produce their own energy like a plant. So they can take the energy from the sun or they can take the energy from a hydrothermal vent and create their own energy. Those are known as producers. Plants and some bacteria will be like that. Okay? Now, if you remember, we talked about different types of energy, but the big one that we focus on this unit is chemical energy. Chemical energy is the energy stored in the bonds of molecules. All right, in the bonds of molecules. So if I have a can of gasoline, there's a bunch of molecules that are bonded together there. But when I break those bonds, I release the energy. So for a gasoline, I'd have to light it on fire. We obtain chemical energy through the food that we eat. So we bring in a bunch of food, specifically glucose, because we use glucose for cellular respiration. When we bring that glucose in, we break it down, we break those bonds, and then we're able to make our own chemical energy, which is going to be ATP. Okay. And then we use that ATP to do a bunch of stuff. Cells use that ATP, an individual cell for things like active transport, or some cells can move, or maybe we're building proteins, or a lot of different things. But anyway, we got to have that ATP for our energy. So what's that ATP look like? Well, then we talked about this. So you have an adenosine here. You have a ribose, which is just a sugar, and this is our triphosphate tail. Remember that there's energy between these phosphates. So that's how we get the energy out. I break one of those bonds right here. And when I do that, it turns into ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate. All right. And that took us to our ATP cycle. Remember that we don't have a bunch of ATP in our cells. We have a lot of ADP. So when we want to make ATP, well, I have to bond a phosphate to that ADP to create ATP. Now I have my high energy molecule. And then I release a phosphate and I release the energy. This was our ATP cycle, if you remember doing that a while back. All right. So I have to constantly regenerate ATP for me to have energy. So what process does that for us? Well, we have, for us, it's cellular respiration, right? This formula down here. And memorize this formula, so important. Plants, producers are going to use this, photosynthesis. We'll come back to that. So cell respiration first. Remember that it takes place in the mitochondria and that it takes place in all eukaryotic cells. What is a eukaryote? We're eukaryotes. Plants are eukaryotes. Fungi, like a mushroom, is eukaryotes. Protists, like algae, are eukaryotes. All these things carry out cellular respiration, and it takes place in the mitochondria. All right. So there's some things on here that you don't need to know, but let's go over the steps of cell respiration. So we start with glycolysis, and remember that glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm, and it's anaerobic, so we're not using oxygen yet. All right. During this step, we break down our glucose and we turn it into pyruvate. Um, that pyruvate is going to go into the mitochondria in just a moment. During glycolysis, we make two ATP molecules, which is our energy. So we're going to come back to that, or excuse me, we're going to use that energy for some of our, for some of our work. If there's oxygen, remember, we only go into these next two steps if there's oxygen present. If there's no oxygen, then we can't do these next two steps. So our next step is citric acid cycle, or the Krebs cycle. We call it the Krebs cycle. It's the same thing. Krebs cycle produces two ATP, and then finally the electron transport chain. Over here, there's some other words here. You don't got to worry about oxidative phosphorylation, stuff like that. But the electron transport chain is going to produce 34 ATP. Remember that this stuff inside the mitochondria only happens if I have oxygen present. Mitochondria powerhouse of the cell. Everybody remembers that, right? Our main energy producer. Um, this is just what it looks like. There's a lot of stuff in here. Just keep in mind that cell respiration takes place in the mitochondria. Um, we're not worried about a lot of this other stuff for our class. Now, what happens if there's no oxygen present? Well, then we go through this process called fermentation. There are two types of fermentation: lactic acid fermentation, which is what we would go through. So this left arrow down here, and then alcoholic fermentation, which is what yeast cells would go through, uh, produces ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. So we talked about lactic acid fermentation. That's if you're doing, you're running a sprint and you do it so long that your muscles start to burn. That's because the lactic acid is building up. Okay, that's because we don't have oxygen available to our cells because we're using it so fast. All right. But we also talked about how we use this process in like creating yogurt and milk and cheese and pickles and things like that. Alcoholic fermentation on the right hand side. Um, Yeast cells, we use this to make bread or to make alcohol beverages and things like that. In this process, we could create two ethanols, which are alcohol, and two carbon dioxide. Remember that this process, even though there's two different pathways and create some different things, main energy is to get the main goal is to get ATP, but we only get two. So these are short bursts of energy. That's why you can't run a sprint for a whole mile or a whole marathon because you can't do lactic acid fermentation for a very long time. Then we get to photosynthesis. We already looked at the equation before, but photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast of producers. So that's a plant. Now, what happens during this time sorry about that. What happens during photosynthesis? In photosynthesis, we bring in light, we bring in water, plants bring in light, bring in water, and bring in carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And they go through two different reactions, the light reaction and the Calvin cycle. In the light reaction, they're going to produce oxygen, which is really important for us because we breathe it in, and they're going to produce sugar, which is C6H12O6 or glucose. Now, how is a plant able to do this? Well, remember, we can't take the sunlight's energy and make our own stuff. We just don't have that capability. But plants have these things called a chlorophyll. That's why the plant's green. But chlorophyll allows it to absorb light energy and then use that energy to go through these processes. All right. And also remember that a plant will release oxygen, will create sugars that we can use, but also plants can use the oxygen and sugar that they made to then go through cellular respiration. So a plant, we talked about this in class, can really keep itself alive because of these processes. So photosynthesis, really, really important. Why is it so important for the environment? Well, it's taking carbon dioxide out of the air, which we talked about how important that is. It's creating oxygen. That we kind of need that. And guess what? Makes this sugar, which all life depends on, because without sugar, we can't go through cellular respiration. Takes place in the chloroplast. Here's what a chloroplast looks like. A lot of different things in here. You have these things, these little pancake-looking things called thylakoids. A big stack of them is called a granum. That's just where the reactions of the photosynthesis reaction are taking place. But what about areas where there is no light? Okay, remember in photosynthesis, plants use sunlight energy to take in carbon dioxide and then create oxygen and sugars. Well, what about if there's no light? They have to find the energy somewhere else. So what they're going to do, these things called chemotrophs, or basically bacteria like on the ocean floor, is going to use the energy from things like a hydrothermal vent, these areas where they're producing really hot gases, really hot gases at the bottom of the ocean floor. They will then use those gases and that energy to go through a process similar to photosynthesis, which will create sugars down at the bottom of the ocean floor. Those would be the producers of that environment or of that ecosystem. All right. Just like a plant is the producer of, the earth, above the sea level. At the bottom of the sea level, the producers would be um, the bacteria that live down there that are taking the energy from the area and making sugars for those organisms. Takes us to this. Remember, these things are really, really um, related, cell respiration and photosynthesis, and they really rely on each other. Okay, chloroplast creates the reactants for photosynthesis creates the reactants for cell respiration. Cell respiration creates the reactants for photosynthesis, and that gives us something called the carbon oxygen cycle. There are a lot of different ways that this stuff uh, circulates throughout the atmosphere, but main thing we're focusing on is we breathe in oxygen and then we release carbon dioxide. Plants take in that carbon dioxide and release oxygen. All right. So that allows carbon and oxygen to cycle through our environment. There's other ways. So like when an animal dies, it actually releases carbon dioxide as it's decaying. When we burn fossil fuels, like you're driving a car or we're burning coal, it's going to release carbon dioxide. And then the oceans have a huge role in this because there's a lot of photosynthetic organisms that are doing that job for us in the oceans. But things like this are messing up the carbon oxygen cycle. Okay, deforestation and activities of humans, and it's leading to something called global climate change. All right, and this is something we'll discuss later in the year. But it all comes back to the carbon oxygen cycle and how we are really messing with those processes. We're chopping down too many trees, which take carbon dioxide out of the air. But then we're also doing more things on the earth, like driving more cars, or we're burning more fossil fuels, or we're just developing more and cutting down more trees because we're building more apartments and buildings and houses and stuff like that. So all this is going to have an effect on this cycle that you have here. That's going to lead to some issues on the earth that may be irreversible. And that's something that we'll talk about more later in the year. And again, something that we will discuss, that you might discuss in a later class, like in an AP Environmental Science. So that's the real quick review of our unit. If you have questions, let me know. Take a look at all of those resources you have on the HyperDoc and study hard.